Let's talk for a couple of minutes about this story, all right? This story begins with how the disciples see the blind beggar differently than Jesus sees him. That's the very first thing on the story. They're looking at the same man, he's born blind, who has been begging there for many years. They've walked by him 100 times, but their reactions to him are very different on this day. The disciples look at him and ask, Master, who sinned, this man or his parents, causing him to be born blind? Okay. I was just reading through this 100 times this week, and this thing just kept coming to me. And sometimes we get so steeped in wanting to make a judgment on something that we do stupid things. Okay? Look at this. Think about this guy. Look at his disciples. Do you think the guy sinned in his mother's womb? What caused him to be born blind? Did he sin or his parents? Have you ever thought about that? I mean, this guy, was he caught? And what did he do? Did he kick mom? What's the deal? Did he sin that caused him to be born blind? They're wanting to know why this bad thing happened. And Jesus, on the other side, heals him. Two completely different responses. Do you notice the difference in the reaction? What a contrast between the heart of Jesus that was moved with compassion to make a difference and the heart of his friends who wanted to know who had sinned. They were making the judgment that sin must be involved. You must be bad because your life's not perfect. Let me share a story. A few years ago, just a couple of months after our family first moved to Oklahoma, we were in a small town of Pond Creek, a town of about 1,000 people, and I got invited to be a part of the community's presentation of Oklahoma. You know, right? Oh, Oklahoma. Here it goes. And so it was a great play. We did a great job. The young man who was directing the play was extremely talented, and he helped most of us perform way above what we perceived our abilities to be. We were just thrilled at what he had done and how it helped us. And so a couple of years later, after that play, and another couple of years after this young man had continued to invest himself, his life into the community, he died with AIDS. Now, we'd worked together for those 2 years, and at his funeral, he had asked me to play Tears in Heaven by Eric Clapton, and somebody sang it, and so we did that because we cared about him. But you know what the worst part of this story was? I mean, besides the fact that a wonderful community lost an awesome young man to a terrible disease, the next worst thing was the conversations that took place around the coffee shop tables where I sat in the next few weeks and months. Most of the conversations that I heard had more to do about how he contracted AIDS than it did about his investment to the community, or that he had chosen to give up the remainder of his life, whatever it might be, to give it totally and fully to those of us that he cared so much about. You see, that's what Jesus' disciples were doing. What caused him to be blind? Sin. It's got to be sin. Who did something wrong? Did you do something wrong? You know, the disciples and we sometimes are more worried about people's sin, while Jesus' heart on the other side is moved with compassion, and he ministers grace to those in need. He does that, and we're trying to find out what's wrong. You see the difference? So Jesus looked at this man, and he saw someone in whom God could work a miracle. Jesus stated to those around him that the blindness would allow, when he was asked, he just said, basically, he's told them that the blindness would allow God to do something glorious. They would be able to see the power of God. And so I think this healing of the blind man allowed God's plan to be seen. God's plan God's plan. See, God's plan is to offer grace rather than judgment. Love instead of, or accepting rather than rejecting. Love instead of hate. And I think I see God's plan in our lives when we are more moved by compassion for others than we are moved by our judgment of who they are or what they've done when we see a person in need. I think that's what causes us, or what shows that we're following God's plan. And you know, for some of us here, there may be some stuff troubling you today. There may be some things in your life that you have issues with, you don't know what to do with. And here's the neat thing. This is the awesome thing about God. God doesn't condemn you. Even if there is sin that's caused something, that's not the question here. Because God wants to heal you at your point of need. God also wants God's plan to be shown in your life. Now, you may say, because we all say sometimes, I just don't see how God can help me. I have an addiction. I don't know how to get over it. I've prayed. I've done some things before. I don't know how to do. I don't know how it's going to work out. But I think sometimes we only get to finally see when we're led by the one who is the light of the world and he shines light in our lives. Jesus decided by sovereign, divine initiative to heal the man. And he did it. Jesus healed this man by God's power. Now, Jesus spits in the dirt and he puts mud pies on the guy's eyes. But I think it's important to remember at this point that the man who was born blind is not healed by spit. Okay? He's not healed by mud. Rather, he's healed by God's power. For the first time ever, think about it, for the first time ever, he sees the world. Imagine that. He's born blind, never seen anything, only could try to imagine, but how do you even imagine if you can't see? Be like us trying to imagine heaven, right? He's born blind, and now he can see. He'd never seen anything before. Now, whether Jesus made new eyes for him or made the old ones work, I don't know. It's not important, but this does tell me that Jesus can heal however he chooses to heal, right? It's not some formula that he used here. And the man didn't have to fill out an application to make sure that he was the most needy person in line in the city to be the one who was chosen to get healed, right? Now here's the thing. Jesus didn't always make mud pies with spit. That's not what he did the rest of the time. Sometimes he did it with a touch. Other times there was a gentle word. One time there was somebody come by and touched just the hem of his robe that he had on, just the bottom of it. Sometimes he healed with a shout. Or sometimes it was just a distance. He said, be healed, and miles away someone would be healed. But it's not the mud, it's not the spit, it's not the pool of Siloam that brings healing. It's the healer that brings healing. It's Jesus. It's God's power. Now think about this. Everyone had already written this guy off. There was no helping him. Not somebody born blind. There's just no helping. And they passed him by every day. But Jesus had compassion on him on this particular day, cared for him, and healed him. And God's power made the difference to this man. So when this man is called to explain the healing to the Pharisees, I love that part of the video. It explains exactly what happened. And then the man says, Jesus must be a prophet. Now you saw, they didn't like that at all. I mean, they didn't like the sound of that. They proceeded to call him a liar. I mean, after all, how would you know if you were born blind? How would you know if this is the first time you've ever seen? You liar. We don't know if that's for sure or not. I mean, think about it, you know? Things that make you go, duh, not but duh. And then his parents are brought in and questioned, are you sure? Are you sure he couldn't see? Are you sure he wasn't just faking it? So you'd feed him when he was 6 instead of quitting when he was 5. And then he's questioned again. And they still refuse to believe that the healing was real or that Jesus had really done it. Now here, I think, is the reason they refused to believe. Here's what I think it is. I think it's because the Pharisees had already concluded that Jesus was a sinner. They had already concluded, they knew. Well, how did they know that? They just decided. I mean, their group had made up a list of things, a guide. They made guides for godly behavior, right? And Jesus, who is God himself, broke this rule by lifting a little mud on the end of his finger from the ground up to the level of this man's eye, and him doing that on a Sabbath caused him to be a sinner because he didn't follow their rules. So he couldn't have done it. He was a sinner. So they didn't have to be told. They already knew everything. You've heard the phrase, my mind's made up, so don't confuse me with the facts. Somebody told me after the first service that explains our political system nowadays, both sides of the aisle, which I wouldn't disagree with that, but we won't talk about politics. I want to talk to us. The question of the sad part is that that's a well-known phrase because it speaks the truth in so many times and ways. So here's what the man did. Here's the blind man. This is what he did. He told his Jesus story. That's what he did. He's healed, and he tells his Jesus story. Now, some of you have a Jesus story too, right? Some of you met with Jesus. Jesus has touched your life in some way too, and you've gone away different after meeting with him. Isn't that true? Is it some of you? It's for sure the case with me. But isn't it interesting how the things we think we know can be the very things that keep us from knowing God? Or seeing how God works. Even when God is so clearly at work, doing wonderful miracles that there's no way you can miss it, but even in that, the Pharisees willfully chose to disbelieve. La, 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 basically, right? They had decided, they said, we know. The Gospel of John is adamant in them saying, we know. We know Jesus is not the Son of God. We know he's a fake. He couldn't have done that miracle because he lifted a little daub of mud from the ground. Particle, just a small fraction of an ounce of weight, and lifted it to this guy's eyes on the Sabbath. Now they pretended to be fair-minded judges, but they wouldn't change their minds no matter what evidence was presented. They pretended they wanted evidence, but everything that was presented was never enough. The people who was there at his boy's birth wasn't believed. I mean, it just keeps going and going. But it went further than just the hate of Jesus. So think about the story as we're talking about here. Their bias rejected the facts, and then it caused them to reject and hate not only Jesus, but the man who had been healed. What had the man done? He's told his Jesus story. You see, God's plan was shown by God's power. God had a plan of showing grace and mercy and love in a place where other people only saw sin and wanted to judge. He showed that by his power. But also God's Son was made known through this miracle of blindness and seeing. What happened was kind of nice. It was neat. Just a good in your face. Because the more they harassed the man that had been born blind but could now see, the stronger his testimony got. Isn't that awesome when that happens? It's like kicker, ooh, all right, go get him. So they started calling him names. And then they unsynagogued him. You know, they kicked him out of the church, is what we would call it today. But it was, I guess that'd be like for telling me you can't ever come back to our church again because, something good happened to you. But it's even more than that because that put him out of the community. There were places he couldn't buy or sell or do things that affected his economic life forever. They rejected him and threw him out. Now again, I know some of you have a Jesus story. A story of how you met with Jesus. A story of how God met you at the point of your need. How God's compassion, God's care, God's plan was shown in your life. And it was God's power alone because there was no other way it would work. Some of you have that story. Maybe you've never told anyone your story. Maybe you've tried to tell it before and some of the people rejected you kind of like they rejected the blind man. Or maybe you've never tried to tell it because you're frightened of what others will think, say, or do. But we're called to believe that Jesus comes from God, that He's really who He claims to be, that He is the Son of God. And so like the blind man, in the words of the great hymn Amazing Grace, I once was lost, but now I'm found. 'Twas blind, but now I. So what is your story? What is your story of how God has changed your life? And what are you going to do with your story? What are you going to do with it? Is it just yours? Or are you willing to look at others with compassion? Or are you determined to judge them by what you think you knew? So, because I think if we're willing to share, we can help build somebody else's faith. But if we only want to judge, we tear down everybody that we judge. Are you really willing to take a long, hard look at the evidence of who Jesus is and what Jesus is doing? Just look around you. And then accept God's way and join in God's work. Maybe for some of us today, the question should be this. Will you give Jesus a fair hearing? Or have you already made your mind up? Where are you at? What is your response?